Okay, so tonight I'm going to be putting a bell housing, clutch assembly, flywheel, and possibly throwout arm, throwout bearing on a 1957 Chevy 235. Now, this video is pretty specific to this motor, but the rules are pretty much identical when it comes to putting a clutch on just about any vehicle. What you'll notice is I've got everything taken apart all the way down to the back of the crank, and the bell housing is off. The way that these motors work is that the bell housing has to go on first, and then the flywheel, and so on and so forth, which, when it comes to working on them, in my opinion, is a big pain. I wish that you could take the bell housing off, but you can't really do that. Just to show you the way that these were designed is here's the bell housing, and it bolts to the back of the block, of course, and then this area over here to the left is where the starter bolts onto. So the bell housing not only supports the transmission, but it supports the starter as well, and the throwout fork and other various components. So anyway, that's how these motors were designed back in the mid-50s, and thank God technology has changed and made them a little easier to work on. I mean, this one's pretty simple, but like I say, the fact that the bell housing has to go on first is a little bit of a pain. But before I even do that, what I've done is, you'll notice this pin right here I have painted yellow, and I will show you that, why I did that, very shortly. And you'll notice that I've already put the pilot bearing inside. In my opinion, it's a lot easier to go ahead and put the pilot bearing in the back of the crankshaft right now, because everything's out of the way and you can get to that hole pretty easily. And what I did is I lubricated it with some full synthetic Valvoline wheel bearing grease and pressed it in with a piece of PVC pipe, something softer than the bronze that it's made out of, so I didn't destroy anything. And it was a really snug fit, but it fits nice and tightly in there. And one of the modifications I did is these motors typically come with a bushing, but I decided to put an actual bearing in there. There are roller bearings inside that pilot bearing there, so hopefully that'll make for easier clutch and gear changes, but we'll see when I get it put back together. So first thing I'm going to do is I am going to put the bell housing up to the motor just to check fitting it. And this piece is pretty heavy. It weighs about 42 pounds or so. But there's a couple guide pins. There's one here and one here. So the bell housing will hang from that. And I believe, let's match the holes up. Guide pin goes here and here. Just painted this too, so it's going to be a real tight fit. So I will get the bell housing put on. We'll do that real fast. Okay, so I put the bell housing and have it hung where it needs to go. And now all I'm going to do is there's two bolts here, one here and one here. And there are I believe there's 4 bolts on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and bolt those on, and we'll go from there. As I said before, I painted one of those guide pins in here yellow. And I don't know if you can see, but there's a little hint of yellow paint on the flywheel, and that's because with these motors, or at least with this one, it could be the case for the other GM motors, but the pattern for the guide pins is not a true equilateral delta formation, triangle formation, so there is a little bit of a difference between the gaps on the guide pins. So there is a specific way that this flywheel has to go on. So I marked them so I would know exactly where to go, because this flywheel, it is really heavy, so I don't want to waste my time trying to put the flywheel in and holding it up, because it's pretty finicky to get it inside the bell housing here. So just put my gloves on because I don't really want this thing to smash my hands if I drop it. Another thing I want to add is this flywheel's got it's been resurfaced, so anytime that you're working with an engine and you need to replace the flywheel, make sure that it gets, if you've taken the work to pull the motor apart and take the flywheel out, go ahead and just get it resurfaced or replace the flywheel if need be, because that pressure plate's got to have good contact with this, and you don't want any blemishes or dust or any kind of particulate that might interfere with that friction pad. So just to be safe, I've sprayed this thing off with a little bit of carb cleaner and a low lint towel, like a chamois or something like something similar to that you can use, and just brush it off to make sure that there's no debris on it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the flywheel and I'm going to kind of position it where I want it, so that when I lift it up in here, I can get it right in place. And this is a really snug fit. There's not a whole lot of clearance, but if you get those guide pins in there, it should just go on there just fine. So I think that it's going to need a little bit of persuading, and I'm just going to tap this dude in place. Okay, this is really just to keep the flywheel from falling off right now. Don't need to put too much force into it right now. So now what I'm doing is to attach the flywheel. There's 6 bolts on this motor, and I believe they're 9/16 thread. I can't remember, but carbide, high density. It's at least grade 8 bolts. You don't want to use anything softer than that. When you've got an object traveling at 3,000 plus RPM, the last thing you want is one of these bolts to break. So what we're going to do is just put these bolts in each hole, and there's a little star washer that goes with them just to keep them in place, keep them from backing out with intense vibration. And we'll just finger tight these. And we're not going to put much pressure on them yet. At the very least, these are tightened by hand and ready to go. Now, before I do this next step, this engine's going to want to turn over, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because every once in a while you want to come out and rotate the engine just a little bit, just to keep the cylinders and the rings lubricated. It's good for them. You don't really want them to sit and not move for long periods of time. So I've been waiting on parts every other day or so. I come out here and just rotate it like 90 degrees or so, just to keep the oil flowing through it. So what I'm going to do now is we need to brace this flywheel up against the bell housing here nice and tight so that it doesn't turn while we tighten those bolts down. Okay, I've got a wrench there locked onto the teeth pretty tight just to keep the flywheel from rotating. and the heads on these bolts are 5/8, and I'm going to use this torque wrench here, and we're going to set it to 60 pounds 0. Don't want to tighten it too much. Don't want to shear off the heads of any bolts. They can take a beating, but you can't be too careful. So about 60 foot-pounds or so. 60 pounds 0. Alright, now what I'm going to do is not really tighten these all the way first. Alright, so sorry about that. It's 11/16 on these bolts. Could be different for your engine, but this one 11/16 on the head. So, like I say, I'm just going to put a little bit of torque on them right now, because you don't really want to just tighten them down to 60 foot-pounds or so to begin with. You want to slowly tighten everything, just one piece at a time. And also what I have going on here is the flywheel is not seated all the way just yet. It's still going to move on these guide pins a little bit, so we got to compensate for that. So we want to just tighten the bolts a little bit, and I can continue to finger tighten some of these right now because, like I say, that flywheel is still traveling up against the back of the crankshaft. Alright, so I'll tighten those and we'll go from there. Okay, I've got these tightened down pretty tight, but now we're going to finally put the full torque down on these. Like I say, 60 pounds 0, and what you want to do is do these in a formation. You don't want to just go around in a circle. What I do is I'll take the top bolt, crank it down, and then I'll go to the bottom opposite of that, and then kind of up at a triangle to bolt number 2, and then over to bolt 6, and then I'll go back down to bolt 3, and then over to bolt 5. So if you can imagine like you're drawing like a couple triangles or so, you want to, top, bottom, top right, top left, bottom right, bottom left. You just don't want to go in a full circle, kind of like that. You want to do like a star pattern. So what I'm going to do now, like I say, is crank these down to about 60 foot-pounds or so, and we want to hear the torque wrench click. That's what we want. Alright, there's one. Two. Hear that click? That's what we want. Three. 4. 5. 6. Okay, so what I like to do after that, just to make sure everybody's happy, is I'll go back through them one more time. It's good. 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 Yep. Good. Alright. 60 pounds 0 on every single one of them. Everybody's happy. So, now comes some parts that might be familiar to you guys, and that's going to be the clutch itself, the clutch pack. What you're going to need is an alignment tool, and most clutch kits will come with one of these. Looks just like this. It's got a loop on the end of it to grab a hold of and pull out. And so what you're going to do, clutch is a little dusty. What we're going to do is we're going to put the pin inside the clutch See that how that spline works? And I believe this is a 10-tooth, 1.125" spline for this particular motor. Now, there's two sides to a clutch. There's a side that goes up against the pressure plate, and then the side that goes up against the flywheel. And it's crucial that you know which side goes on. Most clutches, they'll either be marked with a color, some kind of marking, or they'll actually, like this one, it says flywheel side. So this is the side that's going to go up against the motor, up against the flywheel. And then this side, which is, got some springs to it that protrude from the clutch, that's the side that's going to go towards the pressure plate. So what I'm going to do is put the alignment tool in here, and we're going to search for the pilot bushing, and it should fit. Now it's going to be kind of a snug fit because each pilot bearing is a little different. Now, the fun part of this is, because I've done this before, is that alignment tool, because the bell housing is so shallow, the alignment tool is going to prevent me from putting that pressure plate in. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to raise the pressure plate up and put it up against the flywheel, and I'll probably even put one bolt in at the top just to hold it in place, because it's another pretty heavy piece. And then I'll put the alignment tool in to make sure that the clutch is aligned where we want it. So let me grab the pressure plate and I will do that. Alright, so I've got the clutch inside the pressure plate like this, and what I'm going to try to do is I've got to lift all this up at the same time here and kind of hold it in place, and I'm just going to hand thread this bolt. Sometimes gloves get in the way. There we go. There's just enough thread on that to hold that. Now, what I'm going to do is grab the alignment tool, like this, and I'm going to pick up that clutch inside of here. And there we go. The alignment tool fits right inside, and it's up in there pretty far, so I know that's hit the pilot bearing. So that looks like this. Now keep in mind this pressure plate isn't mounted just yet, but the clutch goes in the center like that, and then the alignment tool will hold it in place. And then what we're going to do is take our screws, our bolts here, grade 8 again, and we are going to bolt it down, and then we'll torque it. Okay, so I'm starting to put some of these bolts in here, and one thing you'll have to do, depending on your application, is change from a long socket, like a deep socket, or a short socket, like I'm having to do. Because down here and then up at the top up here, I can get to the bolts pretty easy, but like this one way over here, gotta do it with a short socket. Now I'm using 12-tooth sockets, which is fine if you're installing something or putting a part on, but with an older vehicle like this, you'll want to use, especially for ones that have been rusted in place or painted in place and are just hard to release, you'll want to use a 6-side socket, not a 12-tooth, because you'll end up, if you're not careful, rolling the socket, as they call it, and tearing it up and rounding the teeth off, and you really don't want to do that. You're going to have a bad time if you do that. So I'm just tightening these one at a time. And in some cases, I wish they were a lot easier to get to, because it's pretty tight up in here. So I'm going to continue. There's 6 bolts around this pressure plate that bolt it to the flywheel. I'm going to tighten these up, and then we'll be able to put the throw-out bearing and the throw-out arm on next. So we'll do that. Alright guys, so I have put the pressure plate on, and one thing you want to keep in mind when you put the pressure plate on is there's 6 bolts, like I said before, and you really just want to hand tighten these. You don't want to crank them down too hard. I mean, you obviously want them on there tight, but you don't want them on too tight that the spring, the pressure plate itself, starts to activate, because that's what your throw-out bearing does. It pushes those teeth up against the clutch. It applies pressure to the pressure plate. So you just want it to be just, a little snug. It looks like I need to tighten it down just a little bit more up in this corner, but you want these all kind of nice and flush, and that's what this inspection plate is for. You can look down in there and you can see that these fingers right in here are up just a little bit. So I want all this to be nice and flush, and so that the pressure plate has a good bite on it. So like I say, you want to just do that real lightly and only apply a few foot-pounds of torque to it. Alright, so here is what the completed product looks like whenever you put the clutch in a 235 like this. So what I've done is, you can see the clutch fork is now installed along with the throw-out bearing. And all I did, just to recap, we put the bell housing on first, and then we put the pilot bearing in first, I should say, and then we put the bell housing on, including the dust cover. I had to do that first on this engine. And then we put the clutch and the pressure plate together, and making sure that the holes and everything line up, and they do. And then we put the flywheel on first and tighten everything down to 60 foot-pounds. And then the clutch and the pressure plate went on after that, and I had to hold the clutch kind of in place around the fingers in here and bolt it up. And I even had to go as far as rotating the engine with a screwdriver to tighten the bolts up, because there's no way you're going to get any bolt tools or any kind of ratchet up in here. So I had to do that, and I've got that all tightened down, and you can tell that the pressure plate is hooked up now, and everything is in line. I even had the transmission on here once just to make sure that everything lined up. So after some trial and error, I realized the hard way that this throw-out, the fork, has got to go on first. There's a little bushing, like a guide ball in here, a pivot ball, and the fork sits on that pivot ball. And I've got another fork just to show you. That pivot ball goes inside right here, and there's a spring or a clamp that sits in there, and it's pressed on to that pivot ball, and it allows the fork to travel, and it pushes the throw-out bearing in and out. Now, there's no way with the leverage I have with just my hand that I'm going to be able to activate this, but what it should do is we should have a about an inch to inch and a half or so of travel, I would say, on this. Now don't quote me on that, because I'm going to have to make some adjustments as we go, because the truck actually has a nut that we can adjust the clutch travel with. But, the throw-out bearing will slide on the transmission shaft back here, and whenever the clutch is pressed down, it'll pull back, and the throw-out bearing will push the teeth and the pressure plate up against the clutch disc, and that's what we're looking for. So the transmission from this point on, it just bolts with these 2 bolts and these 2 here, and slides right in place, and it goes right onto the back of the engine. And the transmission itself is this here is a synchro mesh 3-speed on the column GM transmission, and I'm in the process. I need to rebuild it, so new gaskets, needle bearings, everything, it's all going to be rebuilt. And it's leaking fluid into my bucket here right now, so that back seal is definitely gone. And looks like there was some leaking around the speedometer sending piece, so I got a little bit of work to do. But just to recap, on a 1957 Chevy 235, the pilot bushing goes in against the crankcase, flush up against it, then the bell housing goes on with the dust cover and the inspection plate, and then you put your flywheel on in 60 foot-pounds for each bolt. And then once the flywheel goes on, you want to guide the clutch and the pressure plate together and put it on with your guide tool that usually will come with your clutch kit. So the clutch in first and then the pressure plate, and once you bolt all that on, you've got the throwout fork and the throwout bearing to go right on behind it. So it's a pretty simple process. You just got to know how to torque down each bolt, and you'll definitely want to go back on your manufacturer's manual in order to figure out what exactly the right amount of torque is for each bolt. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.